even if you plan to keep the same job, because Diocletian didn't want industries to die off in a given city due to unplanned population migrations. If you think this sounds an awful lot like the beginnings of medieval serfdom, then gold star for you. We are, right now, transitioning away from the Roman Empire of old and into pre-feudal society. Diocletian was the author of a lot of what defines the next 1,000 years of history. He did it as a response to the particular economic necessities of his day, but once it all took root, it really took root. One thing he did that most definitely did not take root is the last thing I want to talk about today. The infamous Edict on Maximum Prices, which represented Diocletian's last furious attempt to put a stop to inflationary prices. I don't want to spend too much time on it because, well, it was more or less abandoned an hour and a half after it was issued, but still, it is a fascinating little piece of history that deserves some attention, for no other reason than it lets us know that the Romans had 3 kinds of beer: Pannonian, Celtic, and Egyptian, and that the Egyptian kind was considered half as good as the other 2, because apparently Egyptian beer was the Schlitz of the ancient world. After 16 years on the throne, inflation continued to ravage the empire, and nothing Diocletian did seemed to even slow it down. Though his tax structure had been mostly taken off the gold, silver, copper standard, there was no getting away from currency completely, and it drove Diocletian crazy that he could never ensure that wages kept up with prices, especially when it came to his soldiers. Paid to risk their lives in defense of the empire, Diocletian was outraged every time he heard of a soldier being forced to drop a whole year's pay on a single shirt. Price gouging and war profiteering was nothing new, but things had gotten ridiculous, and Diocletian decided that the main culprits were the evil, no-good merchants who were taking advantage of the situation. They were thieving the life savings of good, honest, hard-working soldiers, and it had to stop. In 301, Diocletian had finally had enough, and he issued in typical Diocletianic fashion an encyclopedic edict, divided into 32 sections, breaking down practically every single thing that could be bought and sold, and then setting a maximum price for it. The emperor was careful to note that he was not setting the price, he was only setting the maximum price. If you wanted to charge less, that was your prerogative. Just don't charge more. If you charged more, the edict was crystal clear in the consequences of your greed. Death. Of course, even with the death penalty hanging over their heads, no one paid any attention to the edict. No one had any motivation to turn anyone in for violating it, and everyone paid the going rate for everything, just as usually happens when draconian price controls are put into effect. But nonetheless, the edict was carved in stone and posted all over the empire, so we get to learn fascinating things about what an idealized version of Roman economic values looks like. Per day farm laborers made 25 denarii a day, compared to the 50 earned by a stonemason or a cabinet maker. There were 7 kinds of wine, all listed at 30 denarii each, and one listed as simply ordinary wine, which sold for just 16. Aged wine actually lowered the price, as each of the 7 more expensive varieties dropped to 24 denarii once it was a year old. A lawyer could make 1,000 denarii for pleading a case, and 250 just for filing the opening paperwork. Our old friend Publius the mule driver would have made with maintenance 25 denarii per day, or 4 denarii per mile for 1 mule load of goods. Every kind of grain, seed, or bean you can think of gets its due price, as does every kind of shoe, boot, sandal, and shirt imaginable. Famously, the most expensive item listed is 1 pound of purple dyed silk, which a merchant was not allowed to charge more than 150,000 denarii for. And since the only person who was probably buying purple dyed silk by the pound was the emperor himself, I'd wager to guess that it was maybe one of the few items that actually went for the price listed. As I said, the edict was quietly abandoned just a few years after it was issued, and many historians believe that Maximian and Constantius never even got around to announcing it because they recognized what a terribly unenforceable idea it was. But for a while there, wherever Diocletian went, so went the price edict, until even he began to recognize that he was tilting at windmills. That was right around the time he decided to retire. Not that the two are in any way connected. With that, I'll bring to a close our brief little tour through Diocletian's reforms. We've seen the deep impact he had on the military, the government, and the economy, and in many respects, he was as transformative a figure as Rome had ever known. The empire Diocletian inherited was not the same one he bequeathed to his successors. And perhaps even more importantly, the answer to the age of 4 years ago was almost everywhere a resounding yes. Which is to say that there is nothing at all that prevents us from comfortably placing Diocletian among the top 5 emperors of all time. Next week, though, we'll start to get into why we can't put him at the very top of the pile, and some of the curious moves he made at the end of his reign that damaged the stability of the empire, stability that he had worked so hard to establish, so that when he handed the reins of power off, his successors were more than able and more than willing to take Rome right back into the snake pit of civil war. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 128, The Great Persecution. As we've seen over the course of the past few episodes, the first 15 years of Diocletian's reign represented a sea change for the Roman Empire. Some of the reforms he initiated were embraced as long overdue, while others were fought tooth and nail every step of the way. For example, the uprisings in Egypt triggered by the crackdown on tax evaders. Some of his reforms did not outlast his reign, while others became the entrenched status quo for 1,000 years or more, while others, like the price edict, never even got off the ground. But all in all, there is no question that Diocletian had taken an empire that was adrift and placed it back on solid ground. And impressively, he had done all this with a minimum of ill-advised screw-ups. That is, Diocletian sometimes pursued policies that were disruptive, and sometimes he pursued policies that wound up producing no tangible benefits, but he almost never pursued policies that were both at the same time. I think it's fair to say that this week, we will see him pursue a policy that was both in spades. And ironically, for all that Diocletian did right, it was this thing he did wrong that wound up changing the world more than anything else. The trouble started in 299 AD, not long after Galerius returned to Antioch in triumph, having just defeated the Sassanids. Diocletian and Galerius were together in the imperial residence and decided to have some divinations taken to find out what the future looked like from a metaphysical point of view. But every time the priest reached in to inspect the entrails of a sacrificial animal, he announced that something had gone wrong. Something was preventing him from getting a proper reading. After enduring attempt after attempt, it was finally brought to Diocletian's attention that certain members of the household staff were Christian, and that they had been seen making the sign of the cross to ward off evil demons, aka the gods Diocletian was trying to contact. In other words, these Christians were intentionally sabotaging the emperor's divinations. Diocletian was furious, and immediately ordered all members of his household to make a sacrifice to the gods, and if they refused, they were to be fired. Then, egged on by Galerius and a few other staunchly anti-Christian advisors, he extended his order to the army. Every officer and soldier in the legions was to make a sacrifice. Refusal meant immediate discharge. Diocletian was at heart a deeply conservative man who was trying to restore the glory of the Roman Empire. His desire to connect imperial authority to Jupiter and the other Olympian gods was, for him, not necessarily just cynical propaganda. He very much wanted to get Rome back on the side of the gods who had made the empire great, and he spent lavishly on temples and sacrifices and memorials throughout the provinces to help make that happen. Now, following the reasoning of Decius, Diocletian began to suspect that the continued existence of the antisocial, impious, and sacrilegious Christians was doing serious damage to the relationship between Rome and her gods. So, he began to suspect that it was time for them to go. But he was also at heart a deeply pragmatic man, and wide-scale religious purges can rarely be filed under P for pragmatic. So with his religious conservatism coming into conflict with his political pragmatism, Diocletian turned to his advisors for, well, advice. With Galerius taking the lead, they came back to him with the nearly unanimous conclusion that in this case, his religious instincts must take precedence. Christianity needed to be stamped out once and for all. We have, up until this point, only dealt with the Christians in passing, usually as they intersected with imperial affairs, like when Nero blamed them for the Great Fire, or when Pliny asked Trajan what to do about them. But since Christianity is about to become one of the core defining elements of the Roman Empire, I think I should probably take this moment to give a brief thumbnail sketch of the first 300 years of the Church, so we can get a feel for what it is exactly Diocletian is about to try to stamp out, and what it is exactly that in just a few years will become the most powerful non-imperial institution in the empire. Now, by way of disclaimer, I'd like to say that I am not a church historian, and am not going to delve deeply into the myriad little controversies about, say, who wrote what Gospels, when, why, and how. I just want to give a general overview of how Christianity developed, where it developed, and what it developed into over the course of its first 3 centuries. I am afraid that at times my vocabulary will be imprecise, but I hope that no one will find too much to argue with in the broad strokes. So as I'm sure you are no doubt aware, it is said that around 30 AD, a Jewish holy man from Nazareth named Jesus was put to death by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea. Over the course of his brief career as a preacher, 3 years being the longest estimate I've seen, Jesus had won over a small band of adherents known as the disciples, on traditional interpretations of Jewish scripture and his potential for miracle working. He eventually ran afoul of the Jewish religious authorities, and when he arrived in Jerusalem for Passover, the exact year is unknown, he was arrested by Roman authorities either on sacrilegious or revolutionary grounds. He was found guilty of whatever crime he was charged with and crucified a few days later, which most people no doubt figured was the end of the ministry of Jesus. But the disciples of Jesus were not ready to abandon their leader's message. They continued to meet and worship as he had instructed them to do, and continued to convert their fellow Jews to their way of life. The early church was focused on Jesus' role as the prophesied Jewish Messiah, and that per his teachings, he would soon return from the dead to oversee an apocalypse that would pave the way for the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth. The early Christians expected this second coming at any moment, and lived their lives accordingly, but as